My objective with this whole series is not just to tell you the surface level of how terrible everything is, because honestly, anybody can do that these days if you're paying attention whatsoever to the news, and it is like so unimpressive to listen to someone just rattle off the bad news headlines. What I want for you, dear listeners, is for you to be able to understand this in a more profound way, to be able to know and speak articulately about what's driving it, the fact that our civilization breaks these ecological rules and we are therefore incurring the consequences, and how irrelevant the things that are proposed as solutions are, because they don't do anything to change those fundamental principles. And in fact, as the consequences of us violating the principles catch up with us, we won't even be able to implement the solutions anymore. And also, I am going to go a little bit into the details of those consequences here, but I'm not going to get into forecasts too much because it's all very complicated. And I think that it's enough for the average viewer to understand that activity A is having impact B. And because for the foreseeable future, the plan is to continue engaging in activity A, we are going to see impact B continue to just get worse, more severe, more common. And also, I'd like for you to be able to understand how all these things are interrelated. And when one thing gets bad, it kind of makes other things get worse. Another thing is, people might say, well, it's all just a matter of whatever you want to focus on. So you can be the pessimistic doomers over there, but I'm going to be an optimist and go read Reasons to Be Cheerful. That's a real blog. Don't do it. But the thing is, yes, I mean, I will acknowledge there are positive little stories here, there in the news. But if you're at all interested, and maybe people aren't, but if you are, in actually knowing where we're headed, which I think even the optimists care, right? If you want to have an accurate sense of that, you have to know the interplay between the good and the bad and which one is dominating. And the bad stuff is dominating those trends. And so if this were like an arm wrestling match, they are winning. And that is going to dictate the trends that we see in the future. And finally, I think that the benefit of facing all the sad stuff that I'm about to show you is that if you expose yourself to it and you allow yourself to face it and to anticipate everything that's going to happen, at least in my experience, even though it is sad to read these things as things continue to get worse, you're at least removing the shock and surprise. Like, I think when I encounter other people who are trying to be hopeful and hoping that they're not going to see bad news in the news today, but then they inevitably do because it's still happening, it's going to keep happening. I think that their suffering is worse because they were hoping not to see it, or they were thinking maybe they wouldn't, and then they did, and they had things still surprise them. News stories are still like blowing their minds when these things are dying and this is melting and a fire tornado just took out whatever. And yeah, like again, it still sucks, but an exercise that I actually did within the first few weeks of becoming collapse-aware was I listed every single possible thing that could go wrong, and then I saw it all, and I went through the grief of looking at it and going, oh my gosh, like we're probably going to check off every item on this checklist. But now I know. And now I can go live my life a little bit. Sometimes I'm very still stat. But anyway, and finally, you'll see some notes here. This is the Last Week in Collapse user who has a Substack and a Reddit account. Reddit is free. Substack is, you can subscribe to an email, but if you want to see the whole thing, you might have to pay to subscribe. It's a weekly summary of everything happening around the world. So if you're interested, because I'm making this in 2024, if you want to know where things stand, or for at least in the beginning, if you're interested in keeping up how things are developing, that's a really good source. They put a whole lot of work into it. But also, I would discourage you from doom pilling. So like, get the exposure that you need to understand how everything is interrelated, and to get a sense of like, no, we are indeed headed down this path, but then like, don't remain in the doom scroll. Get out. Okay. Moving on. So this is the Planetary Boundaries Assessment. It is one attempt to evaluate the state of our environment, and it's still in the works. They're adding new categories and stuff. But I wanted to point out here that there are 3 places where we are actually in worse shape than the climate currently is. And those are biosphere integrity, novel entities, and biogeochemical flows. So like as bad as climate change is, there are other things that are even worse, which when you think about it, and like the fact that we're in the 6th mass extinction, like, yes, obviously humans have been destroying habitats for a while now, and we're like just getting started on climate change. So let's not forget that these other issue areas exist. And I'll talk more about these, but quickly, biosphere integrity is like biodiversity and the amount of wildlife, which we've seen is just down to like nothing at this point. Novel entities, pollution, microplastics, that kind of stuff, and biogeochemical flows, which is the synthetic fertilizer that we use running off into waterways. And I'll stop there and talk more about that on a future slide. Just reiterating my previous point that even if you think climate change is really bad and the fact that everything is underwater and on fire, there are things that are even worse than that right now, like the 6th mass extinction, which building solar panels and wind turbines does not address and actually makes worse. We are seeing extinction rates at somewhere between 100 to 1,000 times the like natural rate, because generally in an ecosystem throughout Earth's existence, it's normal once in a while some species becomes unfit for its habitat and it just goes extinct. But we're seeing that happen at a skyrocketing rate, and it is definitely humans and their activity that is causing that. And bringing me over to the insect decline thing, the major cause of the drop in the insect population is the use of pesticides and fertilizers. So our reliance on high-tech chemicals, as well as habitat loss. And that's also the case, even though I don't have a depiction of it here, with the mammals. It isn't climate change that's killing them, yet in high numbers. It's the fact that we've been encroaching on the land that they had previously used as their home and food source. And in the last 50 years, we have seen wildlife populations drop by 69%, which is significant. So even though I literally just said that climate change is not a major factor in all of the wildlife die-off that we've seen in the last 50 years, it is starting to kill things. So I got these headlines from the past like 5 years. There's a whole bunch more on my Substack in case you need evidence, and those are just the ones that I bothered to come across and add. You can probably look up some from the past week. We have Australian flying foxes, grizzly bears, elephants dying of drought, and all this heat seems to be making a lot of things fall out of places. So the monkeys are falling out of the trees in Mexico, birds are falling out of the sky in India, and we have pictured the few that people are working to rehydrate, but of course they can't get to all of them, which is why we are going to see this cause even more dramatic decline and extinction rates. So here are some crazy facts from a Guardian article about how the pharmaceuticals that modern industrial civilization is flushing into waterways is having on species. So we've got brown trout are addicted to methamphetamine now, a few of them. European perch, who were exposed to antidepressants in sewage, lost their fear of predators. Female starlings, also exposed to antidepressants in sewage, are now, their potential mates find them less attractive. And some fish populations have ingested birth control pills, and they've experienced sex reversal and local extinction events. So who knew? Now you do. So I promised you interconnections, and here's an example. India's vultures. In the 80s, it had 40 million vultures, and they provided a very important service, but we'll get to that because humans didn't miss it till it was gone. In the 90s, humans started giving diclofenac to their cows. That's an anti-inflammatory. And the vultures would then eat the cows when they died, and it would give them, the diclofenac would give them lethal kidney failure. And this had consequences because the vultures weren't there to eat the garbage and poop and bodies. Those built up and diseases spread. So 100,000 extra humans died. They kind of like estimated this, who wouldn't have died if it hadn't been for killing the vultures. And they also got 5 million extra feral dogs because those dogs there weren't any vultures to compete with the dogs. So then the dogs had like free access to all of this food suddenly, and their population then increased. And then you saw an increase in rabies bites. And so then an extra 47,000 people got rabies who would not have gotten it if the vultures had been there to prevent the dog population from expanding. So in 2006, India realized this and was like, okay, we made a mistake. Please, please forgive us. We're going to undo it. So they banned diclofenac. But then about 10 years later, if you look at the vulture population, it had not really recovered. It's probably risen, but it's at, as of 2017, it was at 19,000, which is only 0.05% of what it had been in the 80s. So, oops. So, microplastics. We've come to know these pretty well in recent years, and some people are like, oh, my home is plastic free. That's cool. It's still in the clouds, in the rain, in the glaciers, in the tap water, in the soil, even 23 feet deep, and in most food, even if you buy organic. And from there, it makes it into our blood, testes, sperm, placentas, breast milk, lungs, liver, kidneys, brains. We're just like made out of plastic now. It disrupts our endocrine systems, which mean babies are being born prematurely more often, sperm counts are falling, and we are seeing cancer rates rise. And not just as a matter, like it's definitely not just that we're better at detecting it now, it's popping up definitely more frequently and already in younger generations, as I have here. Gen X millennials, 17 different cancers are already more common in them. And they say it might be a matter of a more sedentary behavior, like, oh yeah, we're having 17 more types of cancers more because we should have gotten a standing desk. Big words, eutrophication and hypoxia. And look, it's the planetary boundaries. I told you it'd be back. So these are pictures from the Baltic Sea and China and Gulf of Mexico. It's happening everywhere. So this is when our synthetic fertilizers, the phosphorus and the nitrogen, run off into the waterways. The algae love that. They bloom big time, and then they choke out all the other life, which is the hypoxia. Can't forget pandemics. So the main vectors for all of these pathogens are air, blood, and water, aka poop. So with the air, it's like we confine all these animals, all the livestock into these close quarters. And then all the cows and the pigs and the chickens are sneezing on each other and pooping on each other. And so naturally, diseases spread. The big one right now is H5N1. It's been killing all these wildlife. And then they had to cull all the chickens. And now all the cows in America have it. And so far, so good for us. But they're worried that if it goes to the pigs, it'll go to the people. And like monkeypox is a thing now. Who knows what'll be next? Blood transferred through a number of things, but mosquitoes are a big one. And because of climate change, both the physical range of the mosquitoes is like spreading to new regions, but then also time-wise, their breeding window is widening. So we're gonna have more of that. And then water. So when you have people in close confinement and they're all pooping together, if you don't have sewage systems in place, then more of those types of diseases like cholera will spread. And what we've seen in, for example, in well, everywhere from 2121 to 2022 as a result of natural disasters and conflicts, healthcare has gone down. These infrastructure utilities have not been functioning as well in certain parts of the world. And so we've actually seen cholera rates more than double from 21 to 22. And so, because we know that all places around the world, as our modern system starts to falter as a result of fuel shortages, electricity unreliability, supply chains breaking down, as well as the climate, natural disasters getting stronger, we can expect to see that go up. And then another interesting thing is that from 2024 in Uganda, and here's another example of like the interplay of these different factors, the chimps there would eat this palm, but then because of the tobacco farming, they've wiped out that tree. And so now out of desperation, the chimps are eating bat feces, and then that has 27 novel viruses in it. There's a lot of poop in this slide. And so, like it says there, I will admit the doctors don't know whether these viruses survive in their guts, but it really seems like we are just asking for something big to happen. So now we're going to talk about ocean acidification. And I just want to say that I came up with the idea, the osteoporosis of the sea, before I went to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency's website and saw it there. Anyway, see that little check mark near the bottom right? And it's got those labels of wild mammals and wild birds. You can see already how much we have devastated those populations through our activity on land. And of course, we aren't giving up there. We're not quitters. We're going to continue to destroy habitats so that we can obtain the metals and minerals for our clean technology. But on top of that, we were like, why limit ourselves? Why not also wipe out sea life? So here I've put targets on arthropods and mollusks because when we burn fossil fuels, that emits CO2. The ocean, which is H2O, absorbs that CO2, and then something happens, and therefore there is less of this carbonate molecule, which it turns out a bunch of sea life uses to build their shells. So that's species like oysters, clams, lobsters, shrimp, coral. They can't form those shells, and they also can't find the energy to reproduce, and so that leads their numbers to decline. So now we're going to talk about climate change and just lay down some basic info that I think that actually some people who are understand the climate as a problem, yada yada, still don't know. So because we are pumping out greenhouse gases, which includes but is not limited to carbon dioxide, aka CO2, plus because we are erasing the sinks, so those are the things that otherwise would have been absorbing the carbon dioxide and the other gases, that is making the climate not only hotter, but also more extreme and chaotic. So it doesn't always mean you're going to get a heat wave. Sometimes it means a powerful blizzard or a storm or whatever. And just as a standard, in 2022, our CO2 emissions were 37 billion tons, more or less, and the CO2 concentration in the air was 422 parts per million. And you'll see a lot of articles referencing stuff about 1.5, 2 degrees. And they always say it's above the pre-industrial average. And I, for one, did not know what that was until recently, but I looked it up. And so now you can know too. It was 13.8 centigrade. And then we've always varied, give or take, by 1 degree from that. And so that was what defined the Holocene, which is the time when agriculture emerged, thereby making civilization possible. And in terms of the range that Earth's temperature has ever been, when the dinosaurs were around, it was somewhere between 17 into the low 20s centigrade. And then for the most recent ice age, it went down to 8. And so that's why when we talk about 1.52, a little bit of cranking the thermostat makes a huge difference on what kind of a planet we're dealing with here. Also, climate change. Headline from 2023, the rate of climate change is increasing. So not only is it climbing up and up and up, but it's also getting steeper, steeper, steeper. So it's climbing up faster. It's like if you had a treadmill and then you increased the incline, and that's illustrated really well by these two charts here. One's of the ocean, one's of the air. Both of them are getting not only hotter, but getting hotter faster. So you can see the lower incline is that orange line, and then it ratchets up and gets steeper, and that's the red. Now, I said I wasn't going to get into forecasts. This one is particularly hard to predict, where this is going to go. I just saw a headline being oh, it's going to start declining soon, or the rate of the speed of change is going to get slower at least. I definitely don't think it's going to happen for the reasons that the article says. There's other things that might make it happen, and so this is why I'm not getting into it. But what has already happened, what you're seeing here, is definitely real. So then another thing that I think people should know about climate change is that the warming of global warming is actually happening more in the oceans than it is on land. So no matter how bad you think it's getting here, it's even worse down there. And so one thing that we're seeing is that this is killing off plankton, and then the fish that would have eaten the plankton are starving to death, and then the things that would have eaten the fish, like the whales and seals and seabirds, are also dying of starvation. And so here are some images of fish that have been washing up on shores in droves, as well as a beached whale, and then a top view of a whale so you can see that it's just skin and bones. And they've also observed that the New Zealand fur seal, which has a very diverse diet, is starving. And so they're not picky eaters, so they shouldn't have to be struggling, and yet they are, so not a great indicator. And of course, just to give a shout out to the typical things that people associate with climate change, the more powerful hurricanes and wildfires and tornadoes and droughts and floods and heat waves. Fun. So these two concepts, tipping points and feedback loops, are a little bit more advanced than I want to get in this video. So if you go to my Substack, there are links there where you can learn more. Basically, tipping points are like game changers on the planet. And then feedback loop is something like what I've shown here, albedo, where when it gets hot, the ice melts. And because the ice glacier, the ice cap is melting, you're no longer getting as much reflection of the light back into space. And so that means that it's getting hotter. So like the ice is melting, so it's getting hotter, but then it's getting hotter, so then the ice is melting, which is then making it be hotter because you're losing the reflectivity, so on and so forth, and it kind of builds. So agriculture, this thing that birthed civilization and still very much supports it, is a real damned if we do, damned if we don't endeavor. So we use things in industrial to produce all these large-scale agricultural yields. We use things like heavy machinery, various chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, irrigation, and concentrated animal feedlot operations. So all the livestock crammed together in these factory farms. And so, well, let's say we do that. Well, when we run that heavy machinery, it leads to compaction and it destroys the soil and turns it into dirt. So compaction is when you're just like, all that weight is pushing down on it. And then also because you're turning the stuff, it destroys the organic material, all the bacteria and fungi and roots and stuff that are in there. And so then the dirt goes from being this rich microbiome, the soil rather, to being lifeless, dusty dirt. And then the plants don't actually have what they need to grow in there. The air can't penetrate, the water can't penetrate, the nutrients don't get trapped, the roots can't penetrate. And so it is just this like lifeless substance. And then also, because of the new texture of that dirt, it gets either blown away or it gets, you have erosion every time it rains, which like rain happening is a thing, or droughts. And you also have the fertilizers, which I'll get to next, run off into waterways more easily, which causes the hypoxia and the eutrophication. So then, yeah, this next thing is because the dirt no longer supplies what the plant, dirt, soil. Well, this dirt is no longer soil, so it isn't supplying what the plant needs to survive and thrive. We then have to use all these artificial inputs, because the plant normally has an immune system against pests, and it normally has the ability to like obtain the minerals that it needs to grow and be happy and healthy, but now it doesn't have all that. So we have to add them in artificially. And those things kind of like further disrupt its relationship with its own environment. So it's like a person who like, lives all their life inside a bubble and then just drinks artificial things instead of eating like a healthy diet, and then they don't actually have a good gut microbiome. Like we understand how that is important now, and this is kind of the same thing. So it's all very like sterile. And then because the use of the chemicals actually makes the state of the dirt even worse, because it used to be like a two-way relationship between the plant and the soil. And then also with the irrigation, because climate change is causing these droughts and we're trying to grow so much stuff to supply everyone's demand, we're having to deplete groundwater tables, and that can't continue forever. And then also the feedlot operations, as I have already mentioned, leads to the spread of disease. Or you give all those animals antibiotics, but now there's antibiotics in the waterways, and then we become antibiotic resistant, or the diseases do, and whatever. So like that doesn't seem like a good idea. But not doing it isn't a good idea either, because then we can't produce enough to feed everyone. If you were to stop using machines, and all of these additives, the yields, at least in the beginning, wouldn't be as high. And plus, like if we were like, you would obviously need way, way more labor assisting the people, since they are no longer benefiting from their energy slaves. Ooh, throwback to Buckminster Fuller, remember that? Or we could try to restore nature entirely and be like, you know what, this farm, it should be a meadow or a forest, and then just do that and be like, and it also shouldn't be calories just for us. There should be calories here that we just let the other animals and creatures get. But then obviously, again, that means like less calories, fewer calories for us. But the thing is, too, we don't have a choice about continuing to do it. It is going to end, at least in this form, because the heavy machinery runs on fossil fuels. We know that our access to those is going to be declining, and we aren't going to be able to make some kind of other alternative that doesn't run on that, at least not at scale. Chemicals are all made from those fossil fuels, which we are going to be losing the access to. Groundwater, I already said, we are sucking all of that dry. And then, the animals, that all relies on industrial supply chains to be able to support the animals who are living in the factories. And the diseases that spread in there are also in its own way like self-destructing. And then, of course, as long as we do burn fossil fuels around the world, and ironically within this very agricultural system, we're contributing to climate change, which means more and more extreme events and pressures on the crops, like floods, droughts, freezes, heat waves, more, the pests expanding their ranges, and the fact that climate change is shifting the seasons. So the time when this is supposed to be blooming is not the same time that the pollinator is ready to be there and pollinated, and all this kind of stuff is being thrown way out of whack, and that is going to impact crops. And you remember in video 2, I mentioned that our plan to be able to use renewables to power things is beginning to run into challenges. And here's a little bit of that. So because of hurricanes and blizzards and heat waves, that is causing the grid to go down in places. If there's a heat wave, it means that people can't operate nuclear power plants. There have been some cases of that. And then also because of drought, you can't rely on hydropower to run your factories. And then all of this extreme weather, whether it is too much water, floods, or too little water, like drought and heat waves, it's impeding all of our man-made systems. And so, like, it's destroying roads, leaving trains to be derailed, flooding airports and subways, and then the canals are running dry. And the pictures that I have here of the airports are from Frankfurt, Germany, and New Zealand. But that was like 2 years ago or last year. And then this past year, I remember reading it about in Dubai and Nigeria. They were also experiencing this. So it is just a regular thing now. And then here's my little miscellaneous category, but some other things I've seen in the headlines in just the past year is that as a result of heat, Iran has had to declare a federal holiday because they knew that if they actually had people report to the office, all of that demand on the grid to cool all the offices would cause it to go down anyway, so there's no point. Same concept in the Philippines. They couldn't send the children to school, either because it might bring the grid down or because they didn't even have the infrastructure to cool the schools yet. Anyway, it was going to be unsafe. Greece had to shut down tourist spots this summer. The UK saw its data centers go down, so like people didn't have access to Google. And then in the USA, classic US, a tornado took out a pharmaceuticals warehouse, and then wildfires meant that we had to shut down our nuclear weapons assembly and disassembly facility. So now we've seen the impact that civilization has on its environment, and then also how that disrupted environment is now causing the civilization to malfunction. And so now we'll step back and look at a third layer, which is how are the humans who are occupying this civilization system doing? And whether they are in developed countries or developing countries, they are all members of this and dependent on that machine, or as I called it in the previous video, like a spaceship. Are they putting their brightest minds together and opening their hearts to respond to this emergency? Not so much. So I'm actually not going to say too much about this because, like, this is what a lot of news coverage is about. Like, it's very much focused on us, like our civilized culture within our one species, and why do we always get the spotlight? And also, if you really want to hear more about it, go over to my Substack and there are links to recent headlines. But the main categories to be aware of are international conflict. So as I'm recording this, Russia-Ukraine is one big one, Israel-Palestine is another, and then there are rising tensions with China. Another one is just other forms of conflict, miscellaneous, coups, xenophobia, polarization. Next, AI and surveillance. That's one that people are particularly worried about. I'm less worried about it because that requires electricity, and I think the bigger problem that we are going to be having is a lack of electricity. Poverty, hunger, homelessness, and crime, all interrelated, not those people's faults. Unwellness is what I'm calling, like the mental health crisis, as well as the physical symptoms that people are experiencing more of, and then deadly errors. So like that, the fact that Boeing airplanes are now like falling apart in the sky, and like we recently had the system go down just because one piece of software had an update, but everyone was reliant on it, and then nobody could access records and stuff. So I think that we will also see more of that. So just to highlight a few random stats, in 2021 in the US, 1 in 3 teenage girls had recently seriously considered suicide. In 2022, 90% of countries had fallen backwards in human development. Also that year, 2.2 billion people, which is like a quarter of the Earth's population, were without access to safe drinking water. And then we had more military conflict in that 22 to 23 year so far than since World War II. And also as a result of war and misinformation, we're starting to see nutrition and vaccination rates decline. So for example, in Sudan, in 2021, there were 110,000 unvaccinated children versus in 23, they now have 700,000. Then in 2023, almost half of Americans had diabetes or pre-diabetes. And then finally in 2024, the Philippines said that China is pumping cyanide into contested waters. So that's nice of them. See, here we are as countries getting along. And then also this year, Norway, it had been stockpiling food for a while. And then like for the last 7 years, it abandoned that because I guess they assumed like, oh, it's not necessary anymore. And then just recently they were like, just kidding, resume. The article about this did say that it's like they're kind of just looking around and reading the room and realizing that it's probably something that they want to start investing in again. So I made this point at the beginning of my video, but I'm going to reiterate. It's not just a matter of like, oh, well, there's a ton of good things happening and you're just choosing to focus on the negatives. There are some good things happening, but in general, the bad things are outweighing the good, which is why overall we are seeing the situation go downhill. So like, yes, you could focus on the fact that like, oh, there used to be like 5 of these lions in the wild and there was just a report that now more of them have been spotted. Like, great, but overall we are still experiencing a mass extinction. And by the same token, this is the UN's Human Development Index, which is their way of measuring like how are things going for us, for our civilization. So again, that metaphor of the spaceship and the way that we have now not actually consciously decided, but anyway, we are interacting with our environment in this indirect, material intense way, as opposed to being integrated into it the way that other organisms are. And how is that working to meet our needs? And it looks like it is beginning to malfunction. Things were improving for us, but not for the planet, for a really long time. And at this point, it is running out of steam. The consequences are starting to outweigh the benefits. And this has also been happening since about 2016, 17. So importantly, before COVID, because I think that a lot of people nowadays, they look around and it's because the timing was so close, it's easy to blame it on the lockdowns and be like, oh, things have just been a little bit funky since then. But like now that that's more or less over, at least the lockdowns are, we're just recovering from that. But actually there is something more going on underneath that started a little bit earlier than it and is going to continue to get worse. And so whereas that previous chart was a general index that it considers multiple factors, this is just looking specifically at the one of undernourishment, and we see that that is now rising for the first time in a while. And I also wanted to mention some ways in which unrest is showing up now, and I'm sure it will grow. And so, like in the US, you must be familiar with what happened on January 6th at the Capitol, but maybe you don't know as much about what's been going on in Europe. So, one thing is these farmer protests. The governments have been trying to impose environmental standards on them, which is like, okay, fair enough. But number one, they haven't been providing sufficient like support and guidance to carry that off. It's been kind of unrealistic, the expectations that they've been setting for them. And then also, they aren't applying the same strict standards to other industries that are actually less essential. So like they aren't setting these new restrictions for airlines and stuff. And isn't it way more important that we just meet the food needs, and couldn't we be stricter about flights? But they're not, and so the farmers are mad. They've been using their tractors to block roads. They've been setting things on fire along the side of the road. It's pretty hardcore. But enough about everybody else. Back to us in the US. You know our claim to fame, active shooters. Those incidents have been on the rise, as shown in the chart here. I can let you pause if you want to take a closer look at that. But anyway, given this situation, it is probably for the best that kids aren't showing up to school. This is an interesting analysis by the New York Times. It looked at attendance rates from before and after COVID. And across the boards, even if you look at it broken down by income, race, school district size, or the length of time that the school was locked down and remote, no matter what, you see all of the attendance rates have gone down and like haven't recovered in the time since. So can't say for sure exactly what's going on. Obviously, everyone's case is probably a little bit different, but I think it's safe to assume that like overall it's a bad sign of mental health or what is going on at homes and stuff like that, as opposed to like a good one. So I hope that has been a sufficient overview of how we're doing, whether you're talking about the planet or our man-made systems or us citizens of modern industrial global human civilization. In the next video, we will look at what that means for where we can expect things to go from here.